6 major violations of the Constitution. This presentation covers 6 major violations of the Constitution by the federal government during the 20 years of our nation's history. Beginning with 1804. Officially, the Constitution was ratified on February the 25th, 1789, and some of the individuals that created the Constitution were still alive, and most of their children were. The first of these 6 violations occurred in 1804 and had to do with the election of the President and Vice President. The political parties took over the election process in 1800, and it was a vicious contest. It has been said that this presidential election was an angry, dirty, crisis-ridden contest that seemed to threaten the nation's very survival. A bitter partisan battle between the Federalist John Adams and the Republican Thomas Jefferson. The rural Republican Party fought against the urban Federalist Party, and it was a no-holds-barred contest. Many of the newspaper articles of that period have been used today to discredit Thomas Jefferson. This contest established the feeling that the Constitution was not adequate and created a need for an amendment. Enter the 12th Amendment in 1804. This was supposed to be a fix of the problems that occurred in 1800, but the real goal was to bring the destruction of the constitutional presidential election process. The 12th Amendment was to be the legal foundation for the parties to take over the election, and it succeeded completely. After that amendment, no one questioned the political process, which completely threw out the Constitution in favor of the political parties. The only 2 elections ever held using the Constitution were those of President Washington. Our nation has had 56 presidential elections, and only 2 were legally conducted. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land and has not been followed since the year 1800. The next instance in these violations occurred in the year 1808. The constitutional delegates made binding agreements during the convention, and one of those agreements was about slavery. Many of the delegates owned slaves, but none of them agreed with slavery. They all felt it was a blight on the new nation they were creating. But if the nation was to rise at all, slavery had to be accommodated. In the southern states of the 1700s, slaves were such a valuable property that they had been used as collateral on the loans for the plantations. If the slaves were automatically freed by the Constitution, the Bank of England would have recourse to confiscate all of these plantations. We had just won the Revolutionary War, and if these plantations were confiscated, England would take back 1/2 of the nation. A compromise was absolutely necessary, or the nation would have been destroyed just as it was being created. A compromise was reached that by the year 1800, or 20 years in the future, 1808, or 20 years in the future, slavery could be abolished, as that would be enough time to get the financial foundation to secure the South without loans from the Bank of England. Had that arrangement been kept, there probably would not have been a civil war in the 1860s. But the agreement was not kept, and we had a very serious violation of the Constitutional Convention. The third violation was by Chief Justice John Marshall and the Supreme Court. This occurred in the case Martin versus Hunter in 1816. In this decision, Marshall decided that he needed power over the states. Remember, in those days, the states were independent entities. They had their own governments, constitutions, and laws. Marshall decided that he wanted authority over these entities, and he put them under the federal government. With this case, he decided that the Supreme Court had jurisdiction over the laws and constitutions of the states, and so he took it, and we let him. These states were one of the 2 powers that created the federal government. This would be similar to a young child taking authority over the parents. The United States was a child of only 27 years, while the states had been in existence in one form or another for nearly 196 years. He had no right or authority to take this action, but he wanted more power. It is often said that the states lost their power with the Civil War because of Abraham Lincoln's activities, but in reality, they lost all power and authority in 1816 when Marshall took it from them. Another violation occurred in 1816, which had to do with the second Bank of the United States. There was no authority in 1791 when the first bank was chartered, and there was still none when the second bank was chartered. Article 1, Section 8 had not been amended, and yet we were stuck again with a private company controlling our financial futures. It might be interesting to consider some history at this point. We won the Revolutionary War and then established our nation in 1789. 2 years later, the Bank of England took over our country's financial power. That power was lost when the charter of that bank was not renewed in 1811. Then we had another war with England, which started the next year in 1812. That war continued until 1815, and the next central bank, controlled by the Bank of England, was chartered in 1816. Does it occur to you that each time we finished a war with England, there was a central bank that England controlled, established within a short time? Do you think that there might have been something behind the scenes, that dealings that might to end the war with a plan to establish those banks under England's control? Just a thought. Madison re-enters the picture with a decision in McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, and we have the next violation of the Constitution. He decided to officially change the Constitution with regards to where his authority came from. The Constitution gave him his authority, but it was very limited, and that was not satisfactory. So he decided he should get his power directly from the people and throw away that pesky Constitution which bound him down. There were 11 major violations of the Constitution during this 35-year period, and Marshall by himself caused 4 of them. That's over 36%. Now let's get to the last one of these 11 violations, the 4th one involving Marshall. In 1824, with the case Gibbons versus Ogden, the explanation of the so-called Commerce Clause began. Here they decided to place all commerce in the entire country under their authority. They decided what they wanted the Constitution to say, then decreed it. In this case, they decided that the states did not have any power to regulate commerce. This was the foundation of all of the Commerce Clause violations. It set the stage for this type of violation right to our present day, to the present day Obama fiasco. It is so bad that in the case of Wickard versus Filburn in 1942, it was decided that any food you grew on your land, your family garden behind your house for your own use violated the Commerce Clause. This clause reaches right down to all of the economic foundations of our country. The Constitution has been completely thrown out, and the Supreme Court has been the major factor in all of this.